Welcome, everyone. Today we're diving deep into the lives of women in the Bible.
Really exploring their stories of faith,
Exactly. And we'll be looking closely at Sheri Griffiths' book, Faith is a Woman,
which is such a fascinating exploration of how these women navigated faith.
in their own times and cultures, right?
Absolutely. And it's amazing how much their stories still resonate today.
With the challenges we face, the questions we wrestle with.
They really make you think about what it means to have faith.
So where should we start? I mean, there are so many incredible women to explore.
Well, how about we begin right at the beginning,
With Eve.
the first woman in the Bible. Her story is often seen as one of disobedience.
And temptation, yeah.
But I think there's so much more to uncover if we dig a little deeper.
I agree. Often we just focus on the forbidden fruit and the consequences.
But what about the context? Eve was created from Adam's rib.
Symbolizing equality and partnership.
Precisely. This detail is crucial. It suggests that Eve wasn't subordinate.
But rather created as Adam's equal.
And that changes how we view her choice, her agency in that moment.
Makes you wonder if there was more to her decision.
Than just simple curiosity, right?
It's like, could it have been a desire for knowledge?
A desire to exercise her free will.
Maybe even a rebellion against being told what to do?
It definitely raises questions about the nature of temptation, free will.
And the consequences of our choices.
Eve's story is more than a cautionary tale. It's a reflection of humanity.
Our struggles, our desires, our constant balancing act between what we want.
And what's considered right.
So much to ponder just from that one story.
Absolutely. And that's just the beginning. There are so many more women.
With incredible stories to explore.
Let's move on to Sarah. Her story is one that resonates with many women even today.
Especially those who have struggled with infertility.
Imagine the pain and longing she endured in a culture where motherhood
Was everything. It defined a woman's worth.
It's no wonder she had moments of doubt and impatience.
Like when she gave Hagar, her maidservant, to Abraham.
Trying to fulfill God's promise in her own way.
It's a human response, isn't it?
To try to take control when things aren't happening, according to our timeline.
But what's remarkable about Sarah is that she never completely lost faith.
She held on to that belief in God's promise even when it seemed impossible.
And eventually, against all odds, she gave birth to Isaac.
Proving that God's timing isn't always our timing.
It's a powerful message for anyone going through a season of waiting.
Or struggling with unfulfilled dreams, disappointments.
It makes me think of that, quote, faith is not the absence of doubt, but the decision to trust.
Even when we doubt. So powerful, right?
Absolutely. So Sarah's story reminds us to trust in God's faithfulness.
Even when we don't understand his plan or his timing.
Okay, so we've talked about Eve, the first woman.
And Sarah, who wrestled with infertility and ultimately experienced God's faithfulness.
Now let's shift gears a bit and talk about Rebecca.
Her story is all about taking a leap of faith, embracing the unknown.
Right. It starts with that intriguing encounter at the well.
Remember, Abraham's servant was praying for guidance.
And then Rebecca appears, offering him water.
Such a simple act of kindness.
But it was a pivotal moment in God's plan.
A divine setup, you could say.
And then she makes this incredibly bold decision
To leave her family and everything she knows.
to marry Isaac, a man she'd never met.
That takes some serious courage and trust.
Imagine the conversations with her family.
I'm going to marry this stranger in a distant land because, well, God told me to.
Talk about stepping out in faith.
And it wasn't just about a marriage, right?
It was about becoming part of something bigger.
Rebecca was chosen to play a key role in God's plan for his people.
Her story reminds us that even seemingly small acts of kindness can have ripple effects.
And that God often works in ways we don't expect.
It's a challenge to us, isn't it? To be open to God's leading.
Even when it takes us out of our comfort zones.
To trust that he has a plan, even if it looks different than what we imagined.
Rebecca's journey highlights that tension between faith and the unknown.
And the courage it takes to say yes to God, even when we're afraid.
It's also a reminder that we're not meant to walk this journey alone.
We need community, people to support us, guide us.
Like Rebecca had her maids and Abraham's servant.
Those relationships can make all the difference.
Especially when we're facing challenges and uncertainties.
Speaking of challenging relationships, let's talk about Leah and Rachel.
Now, their story is a fascinating exploration of sisterly rivalry.
And how it intertwines with faith and identity.
They were both vying for Jacob's love.
Battling infertility in a society that placed such a high value on motherhood.
Imagine the emotional turmoil, the jealousy, the pain.
It's a story that speaks to the complexities of family dynamics.
and the different ways we navigate our faith,
Leah found solace in motherhood, bearing many children,
which was seen as a sign of God's blessing in that culture,
while Rachel turned to persistent prayer.
wrestling with God until she finally conceived.
Such different approaches, but both rooted in a deep longing for fulfillment.
It shows that there's no one-size-fits-all when it comes to faith.
God meets us where we are, in our unique circumstances and struggles.
Their story also underscores the importance of grace and forgiveness,
Even amidst rivalry and hurt feelings, there were moments of tenderness between them.
demonstrating the power of sisterhood and the potential for healing even in strained relationships.
So we've explored stories of temptation, waiting, trust, rivalry,
And now let's turn to a woman who embodies bold leadership.
and a prophetic calling, Miriam.
Her story challenges traditional gender roles, especially in a patriarchal society.
Picture this: Miriam, leading the women of Israel in a victory song after crossing the Red Sea.
An image of power and liberation.
She wasn't just a passive observer. She was actively leading and inspiring her people.
And her leadership wasn't confined to music and celebration.
Miriam was also recognized as a prophetess, a spokesperson for God,
Imagine the courage it took for a woman to step into such a prominent role.
especially in a time when women's voices were often silenced,
It's a reminder that God calls and equips both men and women for leadership.
and that we should never underestimate the power of a woman's voice.
And don't forget, Miriam was fiercely protective of her brother Moses,
She was instrumental in saving his life as a baby.
orchestrating his adoption by Pharaoh's daughter.
Her quick thinking and courage played a crucial role in shaping the destiny of Israel.
It's a reminder that even small acts of bravery can have a profound impact on history.
We never know the full extent of the ripple effects our actions might create.
But Miriam's journey wasn't without its challenges, right?
There was a time when she and Aaron questioned Moses' authority,
Leading to consequences.
a reminder that even the most faithful among us can stumble.
But it also highlights the importance of humility, even in leadership.
And it's a testament to God's grace and forgiveness.
That even when we make mistakes, He can redeem our stories and use them for His purposes.
Now let's move on to another woman who defied expectations. Deborah.
She was a judge and a prophetess, leading with wisdom and authority.
In a time when women rarely held such positions.
What stands out to you about Deborah's story?
Her accessibility, for one. Imagine her holding court under a palm tree.
It's such a powerful image.
She was a leader who was approachable, yet undeniably authoritative.
And when Israel faced a military threat, Deborah didn't shy away.
She partnered with Barak, the military leader.
Strategizing for battle, inspiring the troops with her prophetic pronouncements.
She knew that victory wouldn't come through military might alone.
It required divine intervention, and her faith was vindicated.
The Canaanite general was defeated, and Israel was saved.
It's a reminder that God can use anyone, regardless of gender or social standing.
To accomplish his purposes. And it's a challenge to us to rethink our assumptions about leadership.
It's not always about outward appearances or forceful personalities,
It's about wisdom, discernment, and the courage to follow God's leading.
even when it goes against societal norms.
So from Deborah's leadership, let's transition to a story about loyalty and resilience.
The story of Ruth.
Her devotion to her mother-in-law, Naomi, is so moving,
She left everything she knew to accompany Naomi back to Bethlehem.
even though she had no guarantee of security or belonging.
It's a beautiful example of how love can transcend cultural boundaries.
And how female relationships can provide strength and support in the face of adversity.
And then there's Boaz, the wealthy landowner who noticed Ruth.
Her hard work, her kindness.
He became her kinsman redeemer, a role with significant social and legal obligations.
Maybe we should explain what a kinsman redeemer was for those who aren't familiar.
Sure. In ancient Israelite culture, a kinsman redeemer was a male relative,
Responsible for protecting and providing for vulnerable members of the family.
like widows and orphans.
So Boaz stepping into this role for Ruth was a huge deal.
It meant taking on the responsibility of caring for her, restoring her social standing.
Ensuring her future.
And what's remarkable is that Ruth, who was initially an outsider,
A Moabite woman.
becomes the great-grandmother of King David.
And eventually an ancestor of Jesus.
Her lineage is a testament to God's faithfulness.
And his ability to weave even the most unlikely individuals into his grand narrative.
It's a reminder that God sees beyond our backgrounds and social status.
He values faithfulness, humility, and a willingness to follow his leading.
And he often uses the most unexpected people to accomplish extraordinary things.
Speaking of unexpected, Let's talk about Hannah, whose story is all about the power of prayer.
And the depths of human longing, especially when it comes to motherhood.
She struggled with infertility for years, facing shame and heartache in a culture that
Emphasized motherhood as a primary marker of a woman's worth.
it's a pain that resonates with many women, even today.
But what's inspiring about Hannah is that she refused to let her pain define her,
She turned to God, pouring out her heart in prayer.
vowing to dedicate her future child to God's service if he granted her request.
And what's interesting is that the priest, Eli, initially misinterprets her prayer,
Thinking she's drunk, it highlights the importance of persistence.
of not giving up even when our pleas seem to go unheard,
And eventually, God answers Hannah's prayer.
blessing her with a son, whom she named Samuel,
And true to her vow, she dedicated Samuel to the Lord.
entrusting him to Eli's care at the temple.
Samuel grew up to be a prophet, a judge, a key figure in Israel's history.
It's a beautiful illustration of how God can use our personal struggles for his greater purpose.
Hannah's faithfulness had a ripple effect that extended far beyond her own life.
It's a reminder that our stories are interconnected, that our individual journeys,
Our prayers, our acts of faith, can have an impact far greater than we could ever imagine.
So we've journeyed from Eve's choice in the garden to Hannah's persistent prayers.
And now let's step into a story of courage, strategy, and hidden influence.
The story of Esther.
Imagine being an orphan thrust into the opulent yet perilous world of the Persian court.
And then rising to become queen.
Esther's story is full of twists and turns.
The danger and intrigue.
But at its heart, it's a story of faith and courage in the face of immense pressure.
What struck me was her initial reluctance to reveal her Jewish identity.
She was living in a world where her people were constantly threatened.
It makes sense that she would want to protect herself.
But when her cousin, Mordecai, informs her of Haman's plot to annihilate the Jews,
She knows she can't stay silent.
it's a turning point in her story.
A moment of decision that requires immense bravery.
To expose herself, to risk everything for her people.
And she doesn't just rush into the king's presence and plead for mercy,
She carefully strategizes, using her position and influence.
arranging banquets, gradually revealing Haman's treachery.
A brilliant example of combining wisdom and faith in action.
She knew she needed more than good intentions.
She needed a plan, a way to outmaneuver her enemies.
And ultimately, her faith in God's protection is vindicated.
The Jews are saved, and Haman's evil plot is foiled.
It's a reminder that even when we feel powerless.
God can use our unique talents and abilities to accomplish his purposes.
Now, let's turn to the story that lies at the heart of the Christian faith.
The story of Mary, the mother of Jesus.
Her journey is one of humility, surrender, and unwavering obedience.
Imagine receiving the news that you're going to conceive and bear the Son of God.
It's a mind-boggling concept, isn't it?
The implications for her life, her future, her reputation.
It must have been overwhelming.
But Mary's response is one of humble acceptance.
I am the Lord's servant, she says. May your word to me be fulfilled.
No hesitation, no bargaining, just complete surrender to God's will.
And her journey from that moment on is full of challenges.
The journey to Bethlehem, the birth in a humble stable.
The flight into Egypt to escape Herod's wrath.
It wasn't a glamorous or comfortable path.
But Mary's faith remained steadfast throughout.
Trusting God's plan even when it led her through difficult and uncertain terrain.
It's a powerful example of what it means to truly surrender to God's will.
Even when it requires sacrifice and trust in the unknown.
Okay, so we've talked about Eve, Sarah, Rebecca, Leah, Rachel, Miriam, Deborah, Ruth, Hannah, Esther, Mary.
Now let's turn our attention to Mary Magdalene.
A woman whose story is often misunderstood and misrepresented.
She was a devoted follower of Jesus, witnessing his ministry, his crucifixion, and ultimately,
His resurrection.
it's important to remember that
Her devotion to Jesus was unwavering,
she stood at the foot of the cross, grieving as he died,
and she was the first to arrive at the tomb on that first Easter morning.
only to find it empty.
Imagine the mix of emotions. Grief, confusion, maybe even a glimmer of hope.
And then she encounters the risen Christ, mistaking him at first for the gardener.
But when he calls her name, Mary, recognition washes over her.
It's a moment of profound transformation, from despair to joy, from doubt to unshakable belief.
And Mary Magdalene becomes a key witness to the resurrection.
Rushing to tell the other disciples the incredible news.
Her story is a testament to the power of faith to overcome even the darkest circumstances,
And a reminder that God can use even the most unlikely individuals.
to spread his message of hope and redemption.
And what's often overlooked is that Mary Magdalene was considered an outsider.
There were rumors and speculation about her past.
But Jesus saw beyond those labels, recognizing her devotion.
Choosing her to be a key witness to his resurrection.
It's a powerful message for us today. God doesn't look at our past mistakes.
Our perceived flaws.
He looks at the heart, our willingness to follow him.
And he can use anyone, regardless of background, to accomplish his purposes.
Now that we've covered some of the more well-known women,
Let's expand our scope a bit.
and explore the lives of some other remarkable women who played crucial roles in the early church.
Their stories often get overshadowed by the more prominent figures,
Like Peter and Paul?
but they were instrumental in shaping the development and growth of the Christian faith.
We've already discussed Lydia, the successful businesswoman who opened her home to Paul.
Providing hospitality and support,
But there are so many other women whose names might not be as familiar,
but whose contributions were equally significant.
like Priscilla, for example.
She and her husband Aquila were tent makers, just like Paul,
They became his close companions in ministry, traveling with him.
sharing their home, even risking their lives for him.
And what's interesting about Priscilla is that she's often mentioned alongside her husband,
But sometimes her name comes first.
suggesting that she wasn't just a passive partner in their ministry.
She was a teacher, a mentor, a leader in her own right.
There's even evidence that she was a skilled theologian.
Remember Apollos, the eloquent preacher who was lacking in some theological understanding,
It was Priscilla and Aquila who took him aside.
and explained the way of God more accurately?
A woman teaching a prominent male preacher about Christian theology.
It challenges our assumptions about who held authority and influence in the early church.
It's a reminder that women were active participants in shaping Christian doctrine.
And that their voices and contributions were valued.
Their impact was profound and far-reaching.
Then there's Phoebe, a woman commended by Paul for her service and faithfulness.
He describes her as a deacon of the church at Cenchreae.
A term that suggests a formal leadership role.
There's some debate about the specifics of Phoebe's role as a deacon,
But it's clear that she held a position of authority and responsibility.
and Paul entrusted her with delivering his letter to the Romans.
One of the most important theological texts in Christian history,
He trusted her with this crucial task.
demonstrating the level of confidence and respect he had for her.
It speaks volumes about Phoebe's character, her understanding of the faith.
Her dedication to the mission of spreading the gospel,
She was a woman of action, a leader who served her community.
and played a vital role in the early church.
Now let's talk about a woman whose story has generated quite a bit of debate.
Junia,
She's mentioned by Paul in Romans 16:7,
where he describes her and Andronicus as outstanding among the apostles.
noting that they were in Christ before him.
The debate centers around the interpretation of the name Junia,
Some argue that it was a male name,
but historical evidence suggests it was more commonly a female name.
and for centuries, many early church fathers recognized Junia as a woman.
So if we accept that Junia was indeed a woman,
As many scholars now believe,
it challenges traditional assumptions about women's roles in the early church.
it suggests that women were not just followers of Jesus,
But were also recognized as apostles, individuals who had witnessed the risen Christ.
commissioned to spread the gospel.
Think about the implications of that.
A woman being recognized as an apostle.
Holding the same authority as the men who had walked and talked with Jesus.
It expands our understanding of the inclusivity and diversity of the early church.
Showing that women were actively involved in leadership and teaching.
Junia's story, even with the limited information we have,
Is incredibly powerful.
it raises questions about how we interpret Scripture, how we view women in ministry.
How we understand the historical development of the church.
It's a reminder that our understanding of the Bible is always evolving.
That we need to be open to new insights, especially those that challenge traditional assumptions.
And give voice to those who have been marginalized or overlooked.
Now let's look at two women whose story emphasizes unity and reconciliation.
Euodia and Syntyche.
They were members of the church in Philippi.
But Paul mentions in his letter that they were having disagreements.
Conflict that was threatening the unity of the church.
It's interesting that Paul addresses this conflict directly.
He doesn't shy away from it.
He urges Euodia and Syntyche to be of the same mind in the Lord.
And asks a fellow believer to help them reconcile. It shows that even in the early church, there were disagreements and conflicts.
But it's important to notice how these conflicts were handled.
Paul emphasized unity, working together despite differences.
Prioritizing the common good over individual grievances.
It's a message that's so relevant today, when division and polarization seem rampant,
Euodia and Syntyche's story challenges us to examine our own relationships
to see where we might need to extend forgiveness, practice understanding.
and work toward building bridges instead of walls.
It's a reminder that our Christian witness is not just about individual piety,
It's about how we treat one another, how we resolve conflict.
how we embody the love and grace of Christ in our interactions.
I think this has been a great overview of some of the key women in the Bible,
We've seen how their lives and stories continue to speak to us today.
offering inspiration and guidance for our own faith journeys.
And there's still so much more to explore.
So we started exploring the lives of some incredible women of faith.
I think it's amazing how even the lesser-known women played such vital roles.
In the early church, right, their stories offer such rich insights.
Into the diversity and vibrancy of that movement. It's not just about the big names.
Like Peter and Paul, it's about recognizing the contributions of everyone.
And I think what stands out to me is how these women were actively shaping things.
They weren't just passive bystanders, right? They were leaders, teachers.
Influencers, even. It challenges our assumptions about what leadership looked like.
Absolutely. It's not just about holding a specific title or position.
It's about using your gifts and influence to make a difference.
And I think Phoebe's story is a perfect example of that.
Right. She was a deaconess in the church at Cenchreae. That alone tells us a lot.
About her role and responsibilities. I mean, the word deacon implies service.
But also leadership and organization. Think about what that might have involved.
Caring for the poor, teaching, maybe even resolving disputes within the community.
These were essential tasks, vital to the functioning of the church.
And Paul's commendation of Phoebe in his letter to the Romans is so telling.
He calls her a benefactor to many, including himself, which suggests she had resources.
And influence, perhaps financial, which she used to support the church.
It challenges the idea that early Christian communities relied solely on men.
For leadership and financial support, women like Phoebe were clearly stepping up.
And then there's the fact that Paul entrusted her with delivering his letter to the Romans.
One of the most important theological texts in Christian history.
He wouldn't have given that responsibility to just anyone.
It shows the immense trust he had in Phoebe's understanding of the faith.
And her ability to represent him to this new community in Rome.
It suggests that women weren't just learning about Christianity.
They were actively involved in spreading and interpreting it.
Which is fascinating when you think about the implications for women's roles today.
Right. Phoebe's story provides a model of a woman who was both a servant and a leader.
A caregiver and a theologian, all in one. And speaking of challenging assumptions...
Let's talk about Junia. Her story, while brief, is incredibly powerful.
Paul calls her outstanding among the apostles. That's huge.
It sparked centuries of debate and interpretation.
Because it challenges traditional views of women's roles in the early church.
For centuries, Junia was widely accepted as a female apostle.
But later, some scholars tried to downplay her significance.
By arguing that Junia was a male name, even though historical evidence
points to it being a female name. It's almost like they were trying to erase her contribution.
And it makes you wonder, how many other women's stories have been lost or silenced?
Throughout history, women's contributions, even when acknowledged,
have often been minimized or distorted. So reclaiming Junia's story
as a female apostle is an act of justice and a powerful affirmation
of women's leadership potential within the church.
It raises important questions about how we interpret Scripture.
And how we view women in ministry today.
And it reminds us that our understanding of the Bible isn't static.
It's constantly evolving as we engage with it critically and thoughtfully.
Now let's shift gears a bit and talk about Euodia and Syntyche.
Their story highlights a challenge that's all too familiar in any community.
Conflict.
And what I find interesting is that Paul addresses it head on.
He doesn't pretend everything is fine or try to sweep it under the rug.
He directly urges Euodia and Syntyche to reconcile for the sake of the church's unity.
It makes me think about how often we avoid conflict.
Like it's something shameful or embarrassing.
But Paul recognizes that unresolved conflict can be damaging.
It can undermine relationships, create division, and hinder the church's mission.
And his approach to resolving the conflict is worth noting.
He doesn't take sides or impose a solution.
He appeals to their shared identity in Christ, urging them to be of the same mind.
And he asks a fellow believer to help mediate the situation.
It's a model of how we can approach conflict constructively.
Prioritizing reconciliation over being right or winning an argument.
It's about listening, seeking understanding, and finding common ground.
Especially important in today's world where it feels like everyone is at odds.
Right. It's a reminder that unity doesn't require uniformity.
We can disagree and still treat each other with respect and love.
And work together for the common good.
So as we wrap up this part of our deep dive
I want to emphasize the overarching theme of women's contributions.
to the early church, we've seen how their roles were diverse and significant.
From practical service to theological teaching, financial support to bold leadership,
It's a challenge to our often narrow view of church history.
which tends to focus on the male figures.
These women's stories remind us that God's mission is much broader than that,
It's about using our gifts, our resources, our influence to build up the church.
and spread the message of the gospel, regardless of gender or social status.
It's a call to action for all of us.
To examine our own lives and see how we can participate in God's work in the world. It's incredible how these women's stories, spanning centuries, can still speak to us today.
You know, across so many different contexts and challenges.
What really struck me from Sheri Griffiths' Faith is a Woman
Yeah,
was how these women lived out their faith. It wasn't just about believing, it was about doing.
absolutely. They were active participants in God's plan.
Not just waiting for things to happen, but stepping up, making things happen.
And often challenging the norms of their time.
It really makes you rethink that whole idea that women in the Bible were just passive figures.
Oh, completely. These stories are full of strength and resilience.
And a willingness to lead, even when facing incredible obstacles.
And they remind us that faith isn't meant to be a solo journey.
There's that constant theme of community,
Of women supporting and encouraging each other.
mentoring and being a mentor,
Like Rebecca relying on her maids and Abraham's servant.
or Priscilla and Aquila working alongside Paul.
Exactly. Those relationships are crucial.
For growth, for resilience, for staying grounded.
I know I'm constantly reflecting on my own support system.
Me too. Who are those people who challenge me, encourage me?
And who am I pouring into? You know, it's a two-way street.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And speaking of pouring out, the book also highlighted the importance of prayer,
Oh, definitely. We see women like Hannah and Esther
pouring out their hearts to God.
wrestling with their doubts, seeking guidance.
And it's not just about asking for things, is it?
Right. It's about aligning your heart with God's will,
Seeking His perspective, even when it's hard,
surrendering to his plan, trusting in his timing.
which can be really tough, especially when we're going through difficult times.
But that's when we need to lean into prayer even more.
To listen for that still, small voice.
And remember, prayer isn't a one-way conversation.
It's about being open to God's leading, allowing Him to shape our desires.
And let's not forget the incredible courage these women displayed.
Oh, absolutely. Facing opposition, danger, uncertainty.
And yet they chose to trust God.
Deborah leading the Israelites into battle. Esther risking her life for her people.
It's inspiring, isn't it?
Makes you wonder where God is calling us to be courageous.
What risks he might be asking us to take.
Sometimes it's easy to get comfortable, complacent.
But these women's stories remind us that faith often requires bold action.
And the book also emphasizes using our gifts to serve others.
Like Lydia opening her home, Phoebe using her resources.
It's not just about personal piety, it's about making a tangible difference.
Living out our faith in practical ways.
It doesn't have to be grand gestures, right? It could be simple acts of kindness.
Absolutely. Every act of service, no matter how small, has a ripple effect.
And that leads us to the idea of legacy.
Right. These women's lives show us that our choices have consequences.
Not just for ourselves, but for generations to come.
Their faithfulness, their courage, their commitment to God's plan.
It had a lasting impact, shaping history, inspiring countless others.
It's a powerful reminder that we have the potential to leave our own mark on the world.
To make choices that reflect our values. To invest in relationships.
To live in a way that honors God and makes a difference.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into Faith as a Woman,
I hope you're leaving feeling inspired and challenged.
to dig deeper into these stories, to see how they connect to your own life,
Maybe it's about deepening your prayer life, stepping out in courage.
or finding ways to use your gifts to serve others.
Whatever it may be, embrace the challenge. Let these women's stories empower you.
To live a life of purpose and impact.
Thanks for joining us on this incredible journey, and may we all continue to be inspired by these women of faith.
To live out our faith with courage, compassion, and a deep commitment to God's plan. Thanks for listening.